Hi, welcome. This is Arnie Alpert. I'm the New Hampshire Program Coordinator for the American Friends Service Committee, and our show today is going to be talking about privatization of the New Hampshire prison system. Right now, there's proposals being considered by the governor and the executive council. There's some ideas floating around the legislature. Idea that it would be good for New Hampshire to turn over control of our prisons to out-of-state private corporations. A number of people are concerned about that, and that's what we'll be talking about for the next half hour or so. My guests today are Randy Hunneyman. He's a Technical Institute professor at the New Hampshire State Prison for Men, and he's been working in the field of corrections in the New Hampshire Department for 21 years.
Yes, correct.
And also is on the board of the State Employees Association, the union that represents many state workers and is affiliated with the Service Employees International Union. Welcome, Randy.
Thank you.
And then our other guest here today is Dr. Margaret Oot-Hayes. She's an associate professor of nursing at Regis College in Massachusetts and lives in Bedford, New Hampshire. Great. And you've been also involved with this issue for some time now. You've got some academic background in this?
Yes. Actually, the first encounter I had with this particular issue was back in 2003. I was conducting research at the women's prison.
Wow.
And we heard through the inmates, they were very concerned about this issue of being sent out of state.
Right.
So the students and I decided to look at the evidence, which is what we do in nursing, evidence-based practice.
Great.
So let's we looked at both sides of the coin, of the situation at that time.
That's great. I mean, you've also done a dissertation on issues of women who are incarcerated.
That's correct. So the lived experience of mothering after prison.
All right, great. So we've got two real experts here on the situation. Randy, maybe you could start by saying a little bit about how we even got into this situation right now. Why are we talking about this, and what's the process that the state is currently going through?
Sure. Privatization has been something that's been considered now in the state for over a decade. There was an attempt under Governor Benson to lower the cost of corrections in New Hampshire by sending inmates out. And at that point in time, there was a large discussion about the ethical issues involved with this, as well as the good public policy involved with this. And at the time, the state decided it wasn't a good idea to do this.
Yeah, remind us, when was Governor Benson?
This was 2001, 2002 when it was proposed at that time. And then, unfortunately, the cost of corrections has gone up substantially. More and more people are being incarcerated in the state. And the cost of caring for these individuals, providing for their basic needs, has started to be a challenge for budget makers, especially in these tough economic times. The governor has voiced a couple of times an interest in looking at private prisons as an option. And so, at this point in time, several other individuals with regards to elected officials in the House put together some legislation to look at it as well. So these ran parallel. And what the governor did...
I know there was even a committee that was created for a while in the legislature that was supposed to develop a plan to privatize the Department of Corrections.
Yeah, and it's important to know that both of these aren't working cooperatively, they're working independently. So what the governor's office has done is requested an RFP to be put out, a request for proposal, and that those bids have gone out, or requests have gone out and bids have come back. And the department is now currently looking at, as well as the governor's office and the General Services Division is looking at whether or not this would be a good option.
Right. I understand there are 4 companies that have submitted proposals?
At this time, yes.
At this time. You know, it's funny. I mean, usually when the state asks for a contract, it's like, we want to buy 10 snowplows. You know, what can you provide us? This is not exactly the way this process worked, is it? No,
it really isn't. You know, usual market forces aren't at play here.
Yeah.
When one of these companies comes in, especially the scope of what's being proposed. Currently, the Department of Corrections houses close to 3,000 inmates. And what's being proposed is to privatize and to have a private company build a prison to house all of the men in the Concord facility, up to 1,600 inmates, and all of the women at the women's facility. And I believe the count at this point is close to several hundred, almost 300 inmates.
Randy, it's my understanding that in these proposals, they didn't even say, this is what we want. They said, well, you know, we might, tell us about operating a women's prison, a men's prison, or maybe it would be both. Maybe you would build it and operate it. Maybe you would build it and lease it back to the state, or maybe you would do something else entirely, and then we'll try to figure out what we want to do. Isn't that the way the process worked?
At this point, it's kind of a catch-all process. So, and multiple things have been looked at. But what's interesting is after the companies came in and toured, they said it would not be profitable to build and lease a women's prison alone.
Wow. Right.
So, and there's only, there was no bids submitted to build and lease a women's facility at this point.
Wow. And now the state has laid out $170,000 to hire a private consultant to help them evaluate these bids because they say the process is so complicated they can't do it by themselves.
That's correct.
So tell us a little bit, Margaret, about, because you've been looking at this from a national perspective to try to inform this New Hampshire discussion. Obviously our situation might be a little bit different, but the best way we can figure out whether this is a good idea or a bad idea, or if it could be done right, how to do it right, would be to look at the experience from other states. So tell us a little bit about what you've researched and what you've discovered.
Well, we have looked at all the evidence, and we tried to use credible research that has been conducted. Sure. And gathering all the evidence and looking at both sides. So we're not just looking at this from one side or the other. Yeah. But in all instances, the costs are not real because there are things such as litigation. There are much higher rates of inmate-on-inmate assaults as well as inmate-on-correctional staff assaults. There have been escapes. Also, this issue with cherry picking. I'm a nurse. I'm very concerned about.
What do you mean by cherry picking?
Well, cherry picking means taking the healthiest inmates and leaving behind the unhealthy ones. That would be if we were to send them out of state. Okay, yeah. However, in this particular instance, I'm even more concerned because we're going to keep the inmates in state. Yeah. And when we look at the average population of inmates, they are very ill compared to the general population. Sure. They have a lot of chronic diseases, a lot of mental health
issues. Yes. We've got people with a lot of drug and alcohol abuse issues.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's very costly. Yeah. And if we're going to keep them in state, those costs should escalate. Yeah. But that's not going to happen because there's going to be a cap, as I understand. Is that correct?
Yes. The current contract, the bids that are in call for a cap on medical expenses of what these companies will offer, and anything above
so then anything above that comes back to the state. So even if we think we're saving, we might not be? Is that what you're...
That's correct.
Kind of what it looks?
A lot of times when these private prisons are analyzed as far as what the costs are, there are ancillary costs that are associated with them. And oftentimes subsidies are paid by the states, and medical costs are one. They're capped as far as how much these companies will offer for services, and anything above that comes back to the state to be paid.
Now, obviously, what we're hearing, what seems to be driving this, or we would think, is that somehow the state would be saving money by doing this because a private company supposedly can operate more efficiently than the state. So are you saying that based on what you've found, when you actually look at these hidden costs, or what Randy called ancillary costs, it doesn't even add up?
Actually, it ends up being more costly.
It ends up being more costly.
Yes, and I'm speaking costly, not just financially as well. I'm talking about costly to the family system. Okay. So let's look at incarcerated women in general. 80% of them are mothers. And if we look
nationwide or in New Hampshire?
Nationwide. And New Hampshire was actually 82% last time I checked. So when we're talking about building these prisons too, and we look at the state of New Hampshire, it's going to be putting these mothers who are incarcerated farther away from their families, which is really breaking that bond and really impacting the lives of so many children. And making that reunification much more difficult once they are released.
Now, you mentioned also issues of assaults and stuff, and public safety issues inside as well as escapes. Now, of course, we know that doesn't that type of thing happen in all prisons, whether they're run by private corporations or whether they're run by the state?
Well, the evidence shows that it's actually much higher rates, as high as 65% more in private prisons for inmate on correctional staff assaults. And there have even been murders that have occurred in these private run prisons because we have a greener workforce. You know, they're paying less. There's greater turnover. There's less training. They're less equipped. So we're looking at we're cutting costs. So something's got to give.
So the way they're saving money, if they were saving money, you're saying, is by cutting costs on personnel expenses, by hiring what you're calling greener people. You're nodding your head, Randy. What have you heard about this from other states?
Well, as far as labor trends go with private prisons, these companies need to make a profit. And if they're operating at the same levels, cost-wise, within 2%, I think the average is, to public-run prisons, they have to make up that profit margin, and they do make it up through personnel.
Right.
The higher turnover rate means they have less long-term or veteran career-minded employees, so they don't have to pay these higher rates to go with these higher paid professionals. Also, what occurs in this case too is they're going to offer lower wages. And when you talk about an inmate on staff assaults, Mississippi is a great example. Not more than 3 months ago, there was a riot in Mississippi, a 300 inmate riot with a private corrections company that was running the prison, and one private corrections guard. Yeah, it was Corrections Corp of America, actually.
Okay, and that's one of the companies that's bidding to do this in New Hampshire.
Yeah. And a 24-year-old private prison guard was beaten to death, and 17 other staff members were hospitalized in this riot. So these types of things, in other words, and it was found out that this employee was making $9.25 an hour, about the equivalent of what a mall security officer makes.
Right. And actually probably a low enough salary that they'd qualify for public benefits, which means that we'd be paying for that too, I guess. Yes. Are you also saying that the companies that operate these things scrimp by reducing the amount of money that gets spent on training, or is it just that people don't have the experience that they accumulate over time in order to do a really good job in what's obviously a challenging workplace?
It's both.
It's both?
Actually, the Arizona study that recently came out, one of the wardens that was interviewed in this said that she had 80% of her staff was either brand new or newly promoted. 80%. So they do cut their costs through personnel. By a higher turnover rate, they don't have to pay raises, they don't have to pay any of these increased costs that come with holding on to employees. Training, it was noted in Idaho, the gladiator school as they've dubbed it, because the level of assault in this prison is more than all their other prisons combined. The records, or the studies that came out, the records that came out of this showed that most of the staff had like 1 to 2 weeks training. Where in Concord, here, at the police standards and training, our officers are law enforcement officers. They attend an academy at the police standards and training. And I think it's also important to note in New Hampshire, the largest law enforcement agency is the Department of Corrections. So by looking at privatizing, what we're really looking at is the aspect that we want to privatize our law enforcement function in this state.
Right. And why should we care about that? I mean, what are some of the issues about that? What's the
challenges that come with dealing with this population, the issues that come with keeping them or managing these inmate populations so you don't have significant issues, public safety, making sure that they stay, the public stays safe, which is our first primary objective. Recidivism, professional staff, long-term staff can deal with these inmates better, so rehabilitation is better. And there's a long list of costs.
A lot of issues.
There are a very large number of issues that came across in the research.
You mentioned escapes. I want to come back to this issue of sort of why privatization might be a problem in this particular field, but you mentioned escapes as an issue. You're saying that there's a higher rate of people actually escaping from prison?
Well, that's what the evidence has clearly shown, because once again, if we're trying to cut costs, and we have a greener workforce and fewer officers, and an out-of-control inmate population, then it definitely is putting our public at risk.
I think I even read about one place where like the lights weren't even working or something like that. So that, or the alarm system or some of these things that the companies hadn't actually invested in keeping them up. And again, if you're motivated by the bottom line rather than by some type of moral or constitutional obligation to protect the citizenry and help people become rehabilitated, it's a different way of looking at it. And I guess that's what I was thinking about, sort of why privatization of corrections is different than, say, privatizing the cafeteria service at the State House. I don't have a problem with the fact that the cafeteria at the State House is run by a private contractor, but if you've got somebody who makes money for their shareholders by filling the beds or filling the cells, and maybe has an incentive for people to stay there longer, that's a really different type of political or economic calculus, I guess.
Yes, and there is a concern, and I think you can speak better to this in terms of making sure that the beds are filled, if you will, the cells are filled.
Private prison contracts will literally have a what they want to see, a low-end cap on how many beds are filled. And if it goes below that number, the state bears the cost for those unfilled beds.
Yeah.
With that also comes a control incentive on the part of the state not to want to have inmates from outside brought to New Hampshire as a dumping ground for problem inmates in other facilities. But the larger social issue in this that we're looking at with regards to law enforcement, again, corrections is a function of law enforcement. It's a continuity. The inmates are arrested by our local law enforcement officers. They go through the legal system, through our court systems. The court systems go ahead and sentence them, and then they go into the custody of the Department of Corrections, which is directly influenced by the governor's office, directly influenced by other oversight bodies. And this is all positive, so that there's control over what type of programming is offered, how it's offered, these types of things. But when you go with a private company, the profit motive takes over. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, not the type of moral obligation that the Department of Correction has to the citizens of the state of New Hampshire through its elected officials and oversight bodies.
And it's a constitutional obligation as well, which is different. It's interesting that at least 3 of the 4 companies that have submitted bids here already have paid lobbyists working in New Hampshire. And I think that we've seen in other states that sometimes those lobbyists even get involved in lobbying on sentencing policy.
That's correct, they have.
Yeah.
Yes, to incarcerate more populations. So Get Tough on the drug legislation was directly
related to those companies or through.
Correct.
Wow, that's scary. I mean, that's not a, so that's a moral issue, that's a political issue, not just a public safety issue or a taxpayer issue.
That's correct.
From the way I look at it.
It's also important to note that there's a civil obligation in this as well. When we send our offenders to a private prison, we still bear the civil liability for their care and for their education, and any lawsuits that come out of their treatment, whether they're put in a facility where assaults are higher and their health and safety is at risk, as well as their access to programming. The lawsuits will come back on the state of New Hampshire.
So the state's not getting away from it that way.
No.
Wow.
So we become responsible for the behavior of a private company in the care of our inmates, where we have no direct and immediate control or say in how they do it.
That's interesting.
So all these litigations will raise costs greatly, without a doubt.
And there may be more litigation because it sounds like there's actually more problems from these private institutions.
That's correct. In other states, the evidence has shown that there is clearly more litigation because of the escapes, because of the assaults, because of healthcare issues. And
now, we've got a moral responsibility as well as a constitutional responsibility to actually help people get out of prison and return to society. If people have committed offenses, they get incarcerated. You know a lot about the programs that people can experience and perhaps benefit from educationally inside. What is it that enables people to re-enter society in a productive way, and how is that affected by whether the prison is run by the state or whether it's run by a private corporation, from your experience?
In my experience, well, once again, it boils right down to the cutting costs. And what is the driving factor here? And the driving factor is, once again, to keep the cells filled, and less focus on rehabilitating, less focus on trying to get the families reunited and connected. You know, less focus on all the important things, housing, education, jobs. That's what we should be focusing on. Is, if anything, we should be building pre-release centers, huge ones, so that we are preparing our inmates to return to society as productive members of society.
And investing.
Instead of doing more damage.
Investing in the types of things that it will make it possible for people to return, rather than creating a system in which the incentive is the opposite. So if there's in the contract, as I understand you were saying, the way it's written in New Hampshire, the state would be basically saying, we're going to pay you for at least 80% of the cells being full, regardless of how many people we need to incarcerate. You get that money.
That came from the bids. That came back from the vendors and they've said, they're putting caps on it, saying we have to have minimums.
At least
minimum film. Yep.
But then they've still got empty cells. So what happens, like let's say, I mean, we know that from a public policy perspective, it's actually, we're better off if there's less crime and fewer people who are in prison. Yeah. So what happens if you've got a massive private investment in a giant prison and the crime rate goes down so that we don't have as many people who are incarcerated? Well,
you have stranded costs. And at that point in time, the citizens of New Hampshire become stranded consumers. There are no free market forces in effect here. Once this, if the state accepts a bid and privatizes, in this case, it's looking at 75%. It's unprecedented on a national scale. No other state has tried to do this. Other states have used it to offset their overcrowding as a way to control costs in the cost of building new prisons. What New Hampshire's looking at is 75% of its inmates will be housed in a private prison if they accept this. So the challenge at that point then is to provide the safe environment conducive to programming that'll allow them to become rehabilitated, and you don't see that.
But if they've got, say, 75 or 80% of the cells filled with people from New Hampshire and 20% or 25% of the cells are empty, are they just going to leave them empty? Aren't they going to bring in prisoners from somewhere else?
That's another one of the questions that's going to be asked is what is the influence of inmates from other states and other facilities on our inmate populations here in New Hampshire? Most of the inmate population here, aside from a few that are interstate transfer, which the state of New Hampshire then has a say over who they'll take, are from New Hampshire and will be released to New Hampshire. Now the question comes from what happens if these facilities are having problems, private prisons like CCA is having problems in Arizona with gangs. And they need to break up this gang structure, and they send inmates to New Hampshire as a quiet place to tuck them away.
So we'd get the corporations would decide where people get incarcerated?
Yes.
That's correct.
Yes.
And so people from,
prison.
So it's their prison, so they'll move people here from Tennessee or Ohio or Arizona or somewhere and bring them here to fill the beds. Right. I understand they also, some of these companies also run prisons for immigrants who are awaiting trial or detention or being deported. So that also might be part of what happens here, because again, it's you know, if you're running a hotel, obviously you want your rooms to be full. I guess the same thing applies if you're a private company running a prison. Although the moral equation here and the constitutional obligation, I think, is a little bit different.
I think also we need to take a look at what role socially does corrections and incarceration play. What are we attempting to do on the larger scale? Take an individual whose behavior is disruptive to the public, take them away from the public, sequester them, and offer them opportunity for change. But to do that, you have to have a safe environment. Now we take a private prison. It cuts back on its staffing, cuts back on its training. All the studies show that there are problems with safety. Then incarceration does not become the strong influencer, the rehabilitation doesn't become the strong incentive that you see. It's protection. They go down to basic needs. Now you bring in inmates from out of state. They may be high-level gang members and come in. And I know I have experience with this. I've served as a hostage negotiator for the Department of Corrections, so I've been trained in this. Gang influence. Now you have connections with gangs out of state. They come in and influence these inmates who eventually get released. What are we turning back out to the public? Are we turning out an individual that has increased their life skills, changed their perspective on their behavior, coming out with the hope of being successful with support? Or are we turning an individual out that's learned to be overly defensive, overly aggressive because they've had to survive in a hostile environment and now have connections to out-of-state gangs and organizations that they can turn around and start to build networks here in the state of New Hampshire? And by the way, this has already started to happen here. We've already got documented cases of individuals being sent out of state through interstate compact and coming back with more gang experience and influence than when they left. So it's a challenge for us. But we have a say over that. We can control the number of the influence and who they are and identify them. In a private prison, we would have no control over that.
So as we sort of sketch out this picture, it sounds right now from the way you're both describing this that privatization doesn't save money, that it's bad for public safety, that it opens up the possibility of private companies with an incentive to basically determine what our corrections policy is and sentencing policies and all these other things. it's got obviously some moral issues associated with it. What's been driving this, or why would anybody want to do this? I'm not going to ask you to speak for people who are for it, but I mean, what are they thinking?
That's exactly what my conclusion was, because I think it's morally and ethically so wrong to have a private corporation trying to run prisons.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because it could impact the laws.
Yeah.
I mean, are we going to be enforcing new laws to incarcerate more people? I mean, there's just...
That's crazy. I mean, that's, you know, for in order to feed somebody's bottom line and make their stockholders happy, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense as a matter of public policy. So you've got an MBA, so maybe you know about these things. But anyway,
well, ethics is a broad perspective.
It's a different thing. Yeah. Say a little bit, Randy, about the political process that's involved here in terms of, I mean, right now we're recording this at the end of August, and people might be watching this a little bit later on. But where are we at in terms of the process here of making a decision to award or not award one of these contracts, or what might happen here?
Well, at this point in time, the Department of Corrections, the admin services representatives, and some other select individuals have evaluated the proposals and the bids with regards to, do they match up to the RFP. An outside consulting firm has been brought in to look at the financial aspects of it to see if the numbers are what they are. At this point in time, when all this is done, these assessments will be sent to the governor's office, and then a number of individuals that he chooses will sit with him to help to evaluate whether these are a direction we wish to go in. Hopefully at that point in time we'll have the policy debate, because, you know, being fiscally conservative does not necessarily mean good public policy. And the policy debate is a lot of what we've been talking about here tonight, is whether or not this is good for New Hampshire.
I mean, it's interesting that this is a massive public policy issue, but it's being driven by a contract process.
Exactly.
Not by a public policy that says, like, let's start by looking at our corrections needs in New Hampshire and what's the most cost-effective way to provide for what we want. So this will come back then to, if they want to go ahead with a contract, will come back to the Executive Council?
Well, at this point in time, it will go back to the governor for assessment. If the governor decides, and it's all in the hands of the governor at this point. If the governor decides that he'd like to go forward with this, then technically he could just go to the Executive Council with a proposal to put a contract forward, and then we privatize. Or the governor could look at these proposals and say that, you know, this isn't you know, a good choice for New Hampshire. And that could be the end of it. The timeline at this point in time that we're looking at is sometime in October, which is what's been proposed for these reports to be finalized and these companies to come forward with their final evaluations. So whether or not this governor will be the one that will be making this decision, or the governor-elect will be making this decision.
So that's an interesting thing, because we've got an election that's coming up right now, so that, right as you say, Governor Lynch is not running for re-election, and while he appears to be driving a good part of this process, it may not be worked out by the time he leaves office, and the next governor might be the one who gets this. The Executive Council is a 5-member group. 2 of their members are not running for re-election. 3 of them are, but of course there's an election, so we don't know who the 5 executive councilors will be come 2013. So I guess what I'm thinking as we wrap up our time here is that it'll be good for people to talk to people who are running for office this fall, talk to the candidates for governor, talk to the current governor, talk to candidates for executive council, talk to people who are your existing or people who hope to be serving us as representatives and senators in the coming 2 years. And for more information about this, check out New Hampshire Prison Watch. That's NHPrisonWatch.org on the internet to get more information, sign up for email alerts, and get a lot more information, because this is a public policy issue and we are the public. Our voices matter. Thank you for watching.